Hi, my name is Nick Embleton. I'm a neonatologist in the UK in Newcastle upon Tyne, and I'm going to be speaking in the next 30 minutes on 10 key concepts in neonatal nutrition. And these 10 concepts, first of all, the first one is that stores are limited and demand is high. Second, nutrition is more than nutrients. Third, we have one brain for life. We live in a microbial world. Necrotic enterocolitis is common and devastating. Not too little, not too much. Nutrition throughout the life course. Nutritional status. The importance of mother's own milk. And finally, teamwork. So I'm going to go through each of these 10 concepts quite quickly over the next 30 minutes or so. First of all, and most importantly, are that in preterm infants, stores are very limited and demand is incredibly high. Here's a picture from our neonatal unit that I took last year. And I think you can appreciate the complexity of neonatal care. And these are all the things that as neonatologists on the NICU we talk about every day, how much fluid to give the baby and CPAP, blood pressures and all these kind of things. But in that context, nutrition is often overlooked because NICU care is incredibly complex and tends to be focused on the cardiorespiratory management. And all the time we have monitors that will monitor cardiorespiratory status, but very few monitors that are really focusing on nutrition. So stores are limited and demand is high. Here's a picture of Pogacar, who's a Slovenian cyclist who just won the Tour de France. And this guy cycles up and down mountains for a living. And he consumes around about 100 kilocalories a kilo a day whilst he cycles up and down mountains. Put that in comparison to a preterm baby where we know that energy requirements are around about 120 or 130 kilograms a kilo a day. So preterm infants are doing something that requires 20 to 30% more energy than the most demanding physical activity known to man. And importantly, around about 70% of all that energy expenditure is in the brain. If you want to consider protein requirements, this is how many Big Macs an adult would need to eat to be equivalent to protein requirements in preterm babies. So what are babies made of? We need to have some understanding perhaps of body composition in such a premature baby. And this is an amalgamation of work done now maybe more than 30 or 40 years ago. And what this shows you is that the mineral content of the body only weighs about 1 or 2%. Lipid accounts maybe only for 1 or 2% in babies born at 25 weeks, but closer to 15% at term. Protein is relatively constant, around about 10 or 12% of weight. But this means that most of the weight of the babies that we look after is actually water. So a 24-week baby is about 90% water by weight. This means that if you weigh 500 grams, there's only about 50 grams of solid matter. So here's a picture of Theo, a little baby that we looked after a couple of years ago, weighing only 350 grams. So he has to survive with less than 40 grams of lean tissue, yet somehow he's able to achieve this. So when we consider how much energy might be contained within that tissue, let's compare the fact that a preterm baby with 50 grams of non-hydrated tissue is about the same as a chocolate bar. When you put those energy requirements together, they're actually pretty similar. But the available energy left to this baby here is probably only 50 grams. And this means that a preterm infant is perhaps only one bite of a chocolate bar away from death due to malnutrition. Intakes really matter. So over the first week, this study showed that for every extra 10 kilocalories a kilo of energy you got, you had a 4.5-point advantage in developmental outcome at 18 months of age. And for every gram of protein, about an 8-point advantage in developmental outcome. So we need to think nutrition. We need to start nutrition as soon as the baby gets to the neonatal unit, both with buccal, colostrum and standard parental nutrition. We need good guidelines, audits, and we need, importantly, to avoid malnutrition. However, nutrition is much more than nutrients, and none of these nutrients function in isolation. So I like to recognize that nutrition is made up of lots of different components. Of course, we need to consider all the different nutrients, proteins, fats, micronutrients, but we also need to be aware of the functional components, such as human milk oligosaccharides in breast milk. We need to be aware of all the different microbial aspects that are induced by breast milk or the environment that we live in. and then all the technical or socio-behavioral or psychological aspects of nutrition. And all of these four components need to work together. So we need, as I say, to be aware of all the different aspects. We need to provide good leadership. We need to think carefully about the NICU environment and about functional components, but also be aware that nutrients don't function in isolation. Along the x-axis here, I've depicted protein intake, and up the y-axis outcome. This could be lean mass or developmental outcome. And what we see is that a good amount of energy intake, as the energy intake increases and protein intake increases, that outcome improves. However, if you don't provide enough energy, simply providing higher protein won't get you the benefit that you want, because the amino acids will simply be catabolized. So we need every nutrient to build a brain. This is what it looks like if you provide enough macronutrients and micronutrients. But this is what it would look like if you continue to provide enough macronutrients without the micronutrients. And those micronutrients might be phosphate, but equally they could be DHA or B12 or iron, or these sorts of factors here. We only get given one brain for life, and this is really important in preterm babies. In most primates, brain growth is very rapid, particularly in the second and third trimesters, so that by term, most primates have a relatively mature brain. In comparison, the rapid period of brain growth in humans occurs towards the end of the third trimester and in the first few months after term. So humans, in comparison to most primates, are born relatively immature. And between 24 weeks gestation and 2 years of age, humans acquire about 90% of their final adult volume. Now, here's a picture of a rhinoceros with a very large head, but when you look at the brain is actually relatively small. In comparison, the brain of a human baby fills the entire cranial cavity. Here's another way of looking at it. Along the x-axis, I show you body weight as a logarithmic scale, and up the y-axis, brain weight. And you can see that most mammals plot out along that average line. But humans are off the scale at the top here. And in comparison, the human brain is around about 10 or 20 times as big as most other mammals. And everything about placental function and breast milk composition is designed for us to grow a big brain. That is the whole focus of nutrition in early life. Now, not only do we acquire a lot of brain volume in this process, in this time period, but there's obviously lots of different processes going on. Neuronal migration, particularly active throughout second and third trimesters, apoptosis, synaptogenesis that may not complete until a few years of age, and myelination that may even continue into adulthood. And all of these processes are under the control of growth factors, particularly IGF-1. And now there is accumulating evidence that the amount of nutrients we give babies, particularly macronutrients, influence IGF-1 levels. So there is a direct link between nutrient input now and control of various neurological processes. And brain development, of course, is very complex. There are lots of different anatomic regions and lots of unique developmental processes. And all of these need to take place in a time-coordinated sort of pattern for us to bring and develop a normal brain. And so these complex circuits that need to be formed all happen to happen in sequence. And if you don't do the first few steps correctly, you won't be able to do the subsequent steps appropriately either. So the impact of nutrient deficiency on the brain depends on the amount of that nutrient, the type and timing of nutrient deficit, and the duration. So here are three theoretical examples. So A might be an example of macronutrient deficiency, which is particularly common in the first few days. B might be an example of a nutrient like iron, which perhaps you don't need lots of in the first few days, but after that becomes important. Whereas nutrient C might be something really important throughout the third trimester and infancy, like choline or DHA. And so a lack of any of these nutrients will have a different impact because the insult is occurring at a different stage of brain development. And there are lots of mechanisms that might link nutrients to brain development. Of course, we need all the micronutrients for tissue substrate. We then need energy to drive the system, particularly carbohydrates and lipids. We need lots of signaling and growth factors. So, for example, sphingomyelin and phospholipid that you find in the milk fat globule membrane, but also lots of growth factors. Next, we recognize that there are lots of nutrients that impact on gene expression. This is particularly true for folate, B12, and iron. We know that breast milk reduces neck and sepsis, and neck and sepsis are particularly damaging to the brain. And then finally, all the microbial aspects, such as the role of prebiotics like human milk oligosaccharides, lactoferrin, and perhaps probiotics. So we only have one brain for life. The practical elements of that is that we should try wherever we can to prevent NEC. We need to maximize use of mother's own milk. We need to meet macro and micronutrients as soon as possible, and we need to regularly review nutrients. Next, we need to recognize that we live in a microbial world, and the gut really is the inner tube of life. Hippocrates says that all diseases begin in the gut, and when we think about preterm babies, that really might be true. 80% of all the antibody-producing cells in the body are located in the gastrointestinal tract, which means that the gut is the most important part of the immune system. There are more microbial cells in us than human cells, and many, many more microbial genes than human genes. So really, we might think of humans as a superorganism involved in a lot of metabolic and immune processes. But it's important to recognize that human development would be impossible without these microbes. And when you add up the weight of all these microbes, they come to about 1.5 kilos in an adult. So we've evolved in a microbial world, and there's this continual tug of war between how we manage beneficial microbes, but also how we exclude harmful microbes. And that challenge is particularly acute for a newborn baby who has to learn on the one hand to establish tolerance, whilst on the other activating immunity against pathogens. And you might ask yourself the question, how on earth does a 24-week baby who is supposed to still be in utero understand which are the healthy bacteria and what's supposed to be a pathogen? We know that the pattern of bacteria change over the life course. They're very different in adults to what they are in babies when they're first born. But we have very little understanding about what the healthy pattern should be in a preterm baby, because of course preterm babies were not designed to be here in evolutionary terms. When term babies are born, of course, they come into contact with mother's secretions, skin, and these sorts of things. And then they go home and get into contact with all the things in the environment. And we know that initially the bowel is colonized by anaerobic species, particularly bifidobacteria and bacteroidetes, which create and sustain a low oxygen environment. And into this mix, breast milk and breastfeeding support successive waves of colonization. But just think how different this is for a preterm baby. Over the first few seconds, minutes, hours, and days, the life and environment of a preterm baby is very different to that of a term baby. Furthermore, they're touched by hands that are washed with soap and antiseptics. We put bits of plastic into them, we give them lots of antibiotics and maybe H2 blockers. And then even when we give them breast milk, we have to give it in abnormal ways that involve coming into contact with plastics and various aspects of processing. So it's perhaps not surprising that microbial aspects of preterm babies are very different from that in term babies. And to some extent, all preterm infants are dysbiotic with a lack of diversity and absence of key species like bifidobacteria. And we're particularly interested in many of the metabolic products of these bacteria rather than simply these bacteria. Now, this is really important because, of course, bacteria have a key role in the development of NEC and sepsis, and we need to recognize, and I think this isn't widely appreciated, that children are more likely to die from necrotizing enterocolitis or sepsis as a preterm baby than all cases of childhood cancer combined. And so going on in the gut is this continual interaction between microbes, nutrients, and the immune system that changes over the life course. And we can think of NEC perhaps as a breakdown in an interaction between these three different elements, but we don't really understand what might be going on. So NEC is a really terrible disease. It's a pathological term applied to a clinical syndrome. We know it's multifactorial, and unfortunately there's no single diagnostic test. It strikes without warning. Around about half the babies who develop serious NEC require surgery, and about half of those who require surgery die. So this is a really serious disease that tends to dominate a lot of the feeding practices on a neonatal unit. And NEC is probably the end result of lots of different pathologies, and it presents in lots of different ways. And perhaps one way of viewing NEC is that it is one end of a continuum of gut health. So whilst NEC is the visible tip of the iceberg below the surface, going on below the surface are all these other important aspects of dysbiosis, inflammation, and metabolic and epithelial health. So we like to think of NEC perhaps as the tip of the iceberg of gut health, with lots of other factors lurking below the surface, such as the role of inflammation, feeding, and growth. So within the gut lumen is this continual interaction between microbes and nutrients. Depending on the type of nutrients, we change the pattern of gut microbes. But in turn, the pattern of gut microbes influence the pattern of nutrients and metabolites that we might see in the gut. Whilst providing adequate nutrition is really important, it's also important not to provide too much. Generally, I think with preterm babies, we don't need to be too concerned about making them obese. We really need to focus on providing them with enough nutrients to grow a good brain and match lean mass accretion. But during acute illness particularly, it's important that we don't overload the metabolic machinery. And this has been conceptualized by Cohen-Houston and others into these three phases of acute illness. The acute phase, when ventilation and inotropic support is increasing. The stable phase, when you still need inotropes or ventilation, but perhaps the amount of support you provide is decreasing. And then the recovery phase, with the vital support of organs dropping down. And if we think about what's going on in those phases, we know that inflammation is peaking during the acute phase, but this is associated with lots of metabolic changes. So endogenous production of glucose goes up, and there's a suppression of tissue synthesis. And these various clinical processes are matched by changes in different levels of hormones. And so we see an increase in growth hormone and thyroxine during the acute phase, but we also see a suppression of growth factors like IGF-1. This is true in term babies and children. And in preterm babies, IGF-1 is probably suppressed even more. So during stress and sepsis, the body tries to look after itself by producing a surge of catecholamines and steroids. And this in turn increases endogenous glucose production, increases peripheral insulin resistance, which provides more glucose for organs. But also we start breaking down proteins and fats, and this releases a lot of amino acids and free fatty acids. And so during this stage, it's very important that we don't overload the system by providing lots of parental nutrition. Another really important concept is to appreciate the importance of nutrition throughout the life course. We know, of course, that what happens to you as a baby is likely to influence what happens in childhood. But now there's accumulating evidence that how you grow as a baby, but also as a fetus, maybe even before that these exposures influence how you turn out as an adult. Now, of course, our genome is fixed, but exposures during critical periods in early life, during sensitive windows, impact on later health and disease. And this whole area has now been conceptualized under the developmental origins of health and disease, with work going back to McCants and his rat studies in the 60s, but developed particularly by David Barker in the 80s and Alan Lucas in the 90s. And various terms have been proposed, but these are now conceptualized within this overall term, developmental origins of health and disease. And effectively what this does is recognize that exposures perhaps even before conception or in utero or in the postnatal period have an impact on later life. And there are likely to be lots of different mechanisms, both epigenetic exposures, but also toxic exposures and environmental factors, interruptions in preterm babies of the normal pattern of brain development, but also, of course, importantly for us, lots of different nutritional and microbiomic exposures. So this has real relevance to management of preterm babies. There are lots of factors that might associate preterm birth with later outcomes. And we know that in term babies, fast or slow growth perhaps may result in different later outcomes. But unfortunately, in preterm babies, these differences in growth, it's not clear to us in later life whether these are due to differences in growth or actually differences in dietary nutrients. So whilst a lot of people are concerned about this in term babies, I don't think we can consider that in preterm babies that nutrients are necessarily going to cause harm. We do need, as I say, to focus on the importance of catch-up growth in babies who haven't grown properly, providing sufficient nutrients for both the brain and lean mass accretion. And it's really too simplistic to say that rapid growth is always bad for you. So we definitely need follow-up of large trials. And the overall factor that I think we can all agree on is that giving lots of mum's breast milk will always be good. How do we assess nutrition in preterm babies? Well, nutritional status is really quite a complex concept. If you ask people to assess nutritional status, then people look a bit confused. It's easy for us to understand how you might assess respiratory status. People would look at respiratory rate or cyanosis or check a blood gas. And similarly, if you ask people to assess cardiovascular status, they would look at the heart rate and capillary refill, oxygen requirements, these things. But when it comes to nutritional status, people are a bit confused. What is it that we should be measuring? And most people, of course, recognize the importance of monitoring growth and using a growth chart. And people like to think that there might be some blood tests that would help us here. Unfortunately, most blood tests in preterm infants are fairly unhelpful. You can take a blood sample and send it off to the lab and ask for nutritional status. Unfortunately, you don't get a sort of report like this. You get a lot of biochemistry back. And very little of this really tells you how you're doing in terms of providing nutrition. So we need to consider this life course approach to nutritional status. So what happened in the past determines your metabolic capacity to handle nutrients in the present time. And that in turn impacts on later risk of disease, particularly things like diabetes. And there are lots of different aspects to this. And as I said before, you could think about all the past exposures, which might be past exposures to the mother or to the fetus. What's happening in the present time, your ability to handle glucose or lipid, or what your body composition is like, or what diseases are ongoing. And these in turn impact the risk of later diseases, which may be metabolic diseases, but also things like brain outcome. So this is a really complex concept to get your head around sometime. And so we've reduced it to the ABCD approach for babies on the unit. So first of all, A, consider anthropometry. B, think about bloods and biochemistry, so particularly sodium, phosphate, calcium. C, think about the clinical factors, whether the baby is very wasted, whether he has rashes, and what specific clinical factors are there, such as a stoma or lung disease. D is to assess the actual dietary intakes, particularly of your micronutrients, for example, exactly what you got over the last 24 hours or so. And then to consider the wider aspects of nutrition in the environment, so particularly what resources you have, whether you're supporting the mother to provide breast milk and feed readiness and these sorts of things, and particularly emphasizing the importance of involving and explaining all of this to the mother. Now, mother's own breast milk is almost always best in every preterm infant. And numerous studies have shown this is really very important. We've learned a lot in the last 10 or 20 years. But prior to this, I and perhaps many other people used to think of milk just as a fluid that you tipped into this great big long tube, that you suck out the fluid and nutrients, and at the end you produce waste product. That was how many of us thought about milk 10 or 20 years ago. But we've learned that things really are much more complicated like that. And we can think of breast milk almost as if it's a biochemical fluid and a means by which the mother can signal to the baby. And there are all these various aspects, such as the metabolites produced in the gut or interaction with the immune system or microbes, that are really key to understanding nutrition and gut health in preterm babies. So as I've said before, we need to think of nutrition as being more than simply the nutrients you give babies, and in turn, therefore, think about breast milk as being more than simply a food. And there are many, many examples of why breast milk is better for preterm babies. Just about every key morbidity you can think of in preterm babies, be it neck, sepsis, retinopathy, or lung disease, is reduced by exposure to mother's milk. We know that babies who get good amounts of mother's milk have better metabolism in later life, so either lipid profiles or bone mineral density. And also we see better brain development in babies exposed to lots of their mother's milk. And there are really numerous studies that support this idea now. So here's one study conducted in France in a large cohort. Up the y-axis, there's a measure of brain developmental outcome. And then there are 4 groups here: babies who didn't get any mother's milk, babies who just got mother's milk in the NICU, mother's milk for 2 months after NICU discharge, and then milk for longer than 2 months after discharge. And you can see this quite nice linear relationship between exposure to mother's milk and better brain outcomes. So I've rushed through those 10 really important concepts. I guess we could come up with a few more. So just to conclude, stores are very limited and demand is high in preterm babies. Nutrition is much more than nutrients. We need to think about all the functional components, microbial components, then all the behavioral aspects of feeding. Babies only have one brain for life. We really need to protect and grow it as well as we can. We live in a microbial world, and this in turn influences our risk of neck and sepsis. Whilst we need to make sure we give babies plenty of nutrients to grow properly, we need to avoid overloading the system during acute illness. And nutrition is important throughout the life course. How we look after babies now may influence their risk of disease when they're much older. Nutritional status is quite a complex concept, but as I say, I think you can use the ABCDE approach. And there's an overwhelming amount of evidence showing that mother's milk is always best. And finally then, teamwork makes the dream work. What do I mean by this? Well, we need to appreciate that it's not just doctors or not just nurses or dietitians involved in providing good nutrition to babies. So say we have now got good data to show that there is a dose response reduction in just about every neonatal morbidity for human milk, and therefore we're obliged to make sure that we educate staff, hospital managers, children, society, and parents about the importance of this. And we have to do that by adopting a holistic approach, by demonstrating good leadership and advocacy, and providing empathic, careful support for mothers who are deeply stressed at this period in time. So we clearly need a lot more work, but getting good teams together is key to improving outcomes through nutrition. So why is it that mother's own breast milk provides all these advantages? Well, here's a list of about 200 different components that we know are present in human milk, that currently most of these are not present, or at least they're not present in significant quantities in formula milk. And it's going to be impossible to recreate this mixture, this really complex interaction between multiple components. This will never be replicated in formula milk. So formula milk might incrementally change the composition, but we will never ever be able to replace this complexity of human milk. And there in the middle is Harrison, who is a 23-week baby who I've kept in contact with, learning at around 39, 40 weeks corrected age to breastfeed from a mother who very patiently, for months and months of neonatal care, continued to provide him with her own breast milk. So I'm going to finish there, just again to emphasize that the work we do is always part of a team effort, whether it's clinical work or academic work. Here's another cycling analogy. Here are the teams that win the Tour de France things, and they only win it not because the guy in the yellow is the best, but because the whole team worked together to get the yellow guy over the finish line. And so really just to emphasize that nutrition is everybody's responsibility, and that it involves parents and nurses, dietitians, but a whole range of therapists and pharmacists, family support workers looking after the psychological well-being of the mothers, the families, lactation support, etc. So providing good nutrition, key to long-term improvements in health for our preterm babies. So if you want to get in contact with us, our website is there, neonatalresearch.net. You can contact us from there or look at any of our slide presentations there again. And I'll be delighted to take any questions. Thank you for your time and attention.